I thought the WNBA was about basketball, about talent, preparation, and performance. I believed that if you showed up, ready, and played the game the right way, everything else would fall into place. But within my first week, I realized something nobody ever warned me about. This league doesn't just test how you play, it tests how you're seen. It watches how you react when the ball isn't in your hands, how you handle silence, how you carry pressure when nobody explains the rules. And that's when it hit me. Basketball was only part of what I needed to survive here. But the moment I stepped into the league, something felt different. At first, I couldn't explain it. The game looked the same court, same ball, same rules. But the way people moved around each other felt unfamiliar. Conversations had layers, silence carried meaning, and attention didn't always follow performance. That was the first crack in the idea I had carried for so long. I remember walking into my first few practices feeling confident, not arrogant, just sure of what I had earned. I trusted my preparation. I trusted my instincts. I believed basketball would speak for me the way it always had. And for a while, I played like that belief was still true. Then I started noticing small things. Who got corrected and who didn't. Who was allowed to play through mistakes and who wasn't. Whose bad night was brushed off and whose was remembered. None of it was written anywhere. Nobody explained it. But it was there, shaping the rhythm of every day. And the longer I watched, the more I realized that performance wasn't the only language being spoken. There was another one, quieter, more powerful, expectation. Some players walked onto the floor, already trusted. Their mistakes came with patience. Their decisions came with understanding. Others, especially rookies, played under a different weight. Every possession felt like a test. Every hesitation felt magnified. It wasn't hostile. It was calculated. And that distinction mattered. That's when I felt the first wave of confusion. I wasn't playing badly. I wasn't lost. I wasn't overwhelmed by the game itself. But I could feel the difference between being in the league and being part of it. And that difference had nothing to do with box scores. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. Why does the same mistake look different depending on who makes it? Why does confidence feel acceptable on some players and question on others? Why does effort sometimes feel invisible? Those questions didn't come from frustration. They came from awareness. And awareness is dangerous because once you see something, you can't unsee it. The hardest part was realizing that basketball alone wasn't going to explain everything anymore. The game was still there, still demanding, still beautiful, but layered on top of it was something I had never been taught how to navigate. Relationships, perception, timing, silence. There was a moment during one early stretch when I hit shots, made the right reads, did exactly what I was supposed to do, and yet the response around me didn't change. No extra trust. No shift in responsibility, just more watching, more waiting. That's when it hit me. This league doesn't run only on skill. It runs on belief. And belief isn't built overnight. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't being ignored. I was being evaluated in ways I had never experienced before. Not just for how I played, but for how I carried myself when things didn't go perfectly. How I reacted when I wasn't centered. How I handled moments where effort didn't immediately equal reward. That realization was unsettling because it meant the rules I had lived by weren't gone, but they weren't complete either. Basketball still mattered. Work still mattered. But there was something else happening alongside it, something that demanded patience and restraint. I went home one night after practice thinking about how much easier it would be if this were just about the game, about execution and preparation, about doing your job and letting the results speak. But the WNBA doesn't work that way, not fully. It's about basketball, yes. But it's also about understanding the room you're in. And during those first days, I realized I'd stepped into a room where the rules weren't written on the walls. They were learned quietly, through experience, observation, and sometimes discomfort. That was the moment the truth started settling in. I didn't misunderstand basketball. I misunderstood what the league asks of you beyond it. And once that realization takes hold, everything changes. Once that realization settled in, everything around me started making more sense, even the parts that had confused me at first. I began to see the invisible hierarchy that exists in every professional locker room, the one nobody talks about but everybody follows. Veterans weren't just players with more years, they were anchors of the system, people the league had already invested trust in, and that trust gave them space that rookies simply didn't have yet. I noticed how certain players could take risks without consequences, while others had to play nearly perfect just to stay neutral. It wasn't unfair in a loud way. It was structural, built over time, reinforced by seasons of reliability, and that's when I understood that performance alone doesn't reset the order overnight. You don't walk in and change the balance just because you're talented or prepared. You're entering something that existed long before you, and every move you make is measured against that history. I realized that every minute I played wasn't just about executing a play. It was about proving that I wouldn't disrupt what already worked. Coaches weren't just watching shots go in or out. They were watching reactions, body language, decision-making under pressure. Teammates weren't just sharing the floor with me. They were deciding whether they could trust me when the game tightened and mistakes mattered more. And the hardest part was accepting that even on good nights, the evaluation didn't stop. A solid performance didn't instantly change how I was seen. It just kept the door open a little longer. That's when it became clear that this league isn't built to reward flashes. It's built to reward patterns, and rookies live under a microscope until they become predictable in the best way possible. I stopped asking why things felt heavier for me and started understanding that weight is part of the process, a filter designed to see who adapts without breaking. And once I accepted that, the frustration turned into focus because I finally knew what game I was actually playing. The pressure didn't stay on the court for long. It followed me into interviews, into headlines, into conversations I wasn't even part of. I started realizing that perception had its own gravity, heavier than any defender. Some nights I'd play well and still feel like the story around me had already been written, like the narrative mattered more than the minutes I'd just lived through. Expectations became something I played against, not people. Every move was compared, replayed, judged, not just by fans, but by an environment that quietly absorbs outside noise. I could feel it when I walked into the gym, that unspoken awareness of how things looked, not just how they were. And that's when it really hit me that the WNBA isn't only about basketball skill, it's about surviving visibility, about learning how to exist when eyes are on you, even when the ball isn't in your hands. I realized that veterans had already learned this language. They knew when to speak, when to disappear, when to let the game talk, and when to let silence do the work. As a rookie, I was still translating everything in real time. The hardest nights weren't the ones where shots didn't fall. They were the ones where I felt misunderstood, where effort didn't align with perception. That disconnect can drain you if you let it. And there was a moment sitting alone after a long day when I understood that if I kept chasing approval, I'd lose myself. I couldn't control the narrative, but I could control my response to it. And that realization didn't bring comfort, it brought responsibility. Because from that point on, every day in the league became a choice between playing to be seen or playing to be solid. Once I accepted that, my approach began to change in ways that weren't obvious from the outside, but felt massive on the inside. I stopped reacting to every look, every comment, every silence, and started grounding myself in the parts of the game I could control. I focused on being steady instead of spectacular, reliable instead of loud. I learned that in this league, consistency builds trust faster than moments ever could. Showing up the same way every day mattered more than having one great night. I paid attention to details I used to overlook: spacing, timing, communication, effort when the play wasn't designed for me. Slowly, the game felt less chaotic, not because the pressure disappeared, but because I learned how to carry it without letting it bend me. I realized that veterans weren't guarding their space out of ego, they were guarding it out of survival, and the only way into that space was to prove I wouldn't disrupt it. That meant owning mistakes immediately, responding instead of retreating, and staying composed even when confidence felt fragile. The more I leaned into that mindset, the less I worried about how I was being perceived, and the more I trusted my preparation. And in that shift, something subtle started happening around me. Not praise, not warmth, but acknowledgement. The kind that tells you you're moving in the right direction, even if nobody says it out loud. Once that shift happened, I stopped measuring my days by how visible I felt and started measuring them by how solid I was. I learned that the league rewards stability long before it rewards confidence, and that lesson changed how I carried myself on and off the floor. I arrived early, not to be noticed, but to be ready. I listened more than I spoke. I simplified my decisions and trusted the read in front of me instead of the reaction behind me. When mistakes happened, I didn't explain them away. I owned them and moved on. That alone changed how the room felt. I could sense it in the way communication became clearer and how instructions stopped being over-explained and how responsibility quietly increased. Veterans weren't suddenly friendly, but they were no longer cautious, and that distinction mattered. I realized that trust here isn't emotional, it's operational. It's about knowing someone will be where they're supposed to be, will respond the right way under stress, will stay composed when the moment tightens. The more I accepted that standard, the less I felt the need to prove myself, and the more I focused on meeting it. The pressure didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling personal. It became part of the structure, something to work within instead of fight against. And in that adjustment, I finally understood that adapting didn't mean losing myself. It meant sharpening who I already was so I could survive in a system that doesn't bend for anyone. And when I think about it now, I'm almost grateful that the league didn't meet me with comfort. If it had been easy, I might have mistaken confidence for readiness. The WNBA forced me to slow down, to listen, to understand that growth doesn't always feel rewarding in the moment. It taught me that being tested isn't the same as being doubted, and that resistance is often the clearest sign that something matters. I learned to respect the process instead of rushing the result, to trust quiet progress over loud approval, and that lesson extends far beyond basketball. In any space where the stakes are high, where the room is already built, you don't walk in and change it overnight. You earn your place by staying steady when it would be easier to shrink or react. That's what this journey gave me. Not just a deeper understanding of the game, but a deeper understanding of myself. And if you're watching this because you're navigating your own version of pressure, uncertainty, or feeling out of place, know this. Growth rarely looks the way we imagine it will. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it looks like staying long enough for trust to finally recognize you.